A settler family could plant their fields and tend their gardens with all the care in the world and still lose everything to an enemy smaller than a fingernail. Insects, beetles, caterpillars, flies, and worms could strip a crop bare in days, and a ruined harvest meant a hungry winter, and the settlers had no can of bug spray to reach for. What they had was plants. The pioneers knew something we are only now remembering: that certain plants, grown in the right places, could protect a whole garden from the insects and pests that threatened it, not by poison but by scent, by confusion, and by drawing the enemy away. They built their gardens like a fortress, with living plants standing guard over the crops that kept them alive. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the early settlers grew to protect their crops from bugs without a single chemical. What each one did, how they used it, and why it worked. And number 5 is a plant the settlers planted as a deliberate trap to sacrifice itself and save the rest of the garden. To a settler, a pest problem was not an annoyance. It was a threat to survival itself. There were no stores to replace a lost harvest, no income to buy food that did not grow. The crops in that garden were the family's entire food supply for the year. So, protecting them from insects was deadly serious work, and the settlers became masters of it, using nothing but the plants around them. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old, fading knowledge. It is not medical advice, and it is not foraging advice. Many plants have dangerous look-alikes, and you should never eat or use any plant without expert identification. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who learned to defend their crops from 1,000 tiny enemies using only the green allies they planted alongside them. The settlers understood their garden as a kind of battlefield, and they were clever generals. They knew that planting all of one crop in a single block was like ringing a dinner bell for the pests that loved it. So instead, they mixed their plantings, tucking protective plants in among the vegetables, surrounding the beds with fragrant guardians, and using the natural powers of plants to confuse, repel, and distract the insects. This was the old art of companion planting, though they did not call it that. It was simply how you gardened if you wanted to eat. Certain flowers and herbs planted beside the vegetables seemed to keep the bugs away. Certain strong scents seemed to hide the crops from the pests that hunted by smell, and certain plants drew the enemy to themselves, away from the precious food. The settlers learned all of it by watching, season after season. Much of this wisdom came from the old country, and much from the native peoples who had grown food on this land for thousands of years. Together, it became the practical defense of the American garden. And like so much of it, it faded when we reached for the chemical sprays instead. Today we remember it, beginning with the first plant. And as we go, keep in mind the great principle behind all of it. The settlers did not try to create a garden with no insects at all, which is neither possible nor even desirable. They aimed instead for balance, a garden where the harmful pests were kept in check by scent, by distraction, and by their natural enemies, so that the crops could thrive. It was a gentler, wiser kind of war than the one we wage with chemicals today, and in many ways a more successful one. Number 1. Marigold. We have met the marigold before in this garden, guarding against larger creatures, but its greatest fame of all is as a protector of crops against insects and the tiny pests of the soil. No plant was more widely planted among the vegetables for protection than the humble, bright marigold. Settler gardeners planted marigolds in borders and scattered them throughout the vegetable beds, especially among the tomatoes, beans, and other tender crops. That sharp, musky scent, rising from both the flowers and the roots, was believed to confuse and repel many of the insects that came hunting for those vegetables. Where the marigolds grew thick, the bugs seemed to lose their way, and the marigold worked underground as well as above it. Its roots release substances into the soil that are famously disliked by certain tiny pests that attack plant roots, the nearly invisible enemies that can quietly destroy a crop from below. By planting marigolds among the vegetables, the settlers guarded both the leaves above and the roots beneath, a double layer of protection from one cheerful flower. And the marigold earned a kind of affection in the settler garden that went beyond its usefulness. After the hard, practical work of planting food crops in their neat rows, a border of bright golden marigolds brought a welcome splash of cheer and color to the vegetable patch. That it also guarded the crops made it the perfect settler plant, beauty and use together, asking nothing and giving on every side. The gardener's eye and the gardener's belly were both the better for it. This is why the marigold has been planted in vegetable gardens around the world for so very long. It is beautiful. It is tough. It grows easily from seed, and it stands faithful guard over the crops all season long. To use it as the settlers did, plant marigolds generously throughout and around your vegetable beds. The next plant brought a sharp scent the bugs could not bear, and the settlers noticed something else about the marigold that made it doubly precious in the garden. It bloomed long and faithfully, all through the growing season, from the warmth of early summer until the first hard frosts of fall. That meant its protection was not for a week or two, but for the entire span of time the vegetables needed guarding. A steadfast sentinel that never left its post until the harvest was safely in. Number 2. Basil. Basil is a wonderfully fragrant herb that we treasure today in the kitchen. But the settlers valued it just as much standing guard in the garden. That same powerful, spicy aroma that makes basil so delicious is something a great many garden pests strongly dislike. Settler gardeners planted basil among their vegetables, and most famously right beside the tomatoes, a partnership gardeners still swear by to this very day. The strong scent of the basil was believed to help drive away the flies, the hornworms, and the other insects that plagued the tomato plants. While the two grew happily side by side, it was protection and seasoning, growing in the very same bed. The pungent oils that fill basil's leaves are the secret. To an insect hunting by smell for its favorite food, a strong, unfamiliar scent like basil masks and confuses the trail, making it harder to find the crop it came for. The settlers did not know the chemistry, but they knew that tomatoes guarded by basil seemed to fare better, and they planted accordingly. And the partnership of basil and tomato shows how the settlers learned their craft, not from books, but from patient watching over many seasons. One year, a gardener might notice that the tomatoes set near the basil suffered less from the flies and worms. The next year, she would plant more basil among them and watch again. Slowly, season by season, careful observation hardened into trusted knowledge, passed on to daughters and neighbors. This was science of a humble, practical, deeply human kind. And of course, basil paid double rent because it was a prized food in its own right, flavoring the family's meals. A plant that protected the tomatoes and then seasoned them on the plate was exactly the kind of clever, hard-working ally the settlers loved. To use it as they did, plant basil among and beside your tomatoes and other tender crops. The next plant was a fragrant wall against the flying pests. And there was an old wisdom in pairing the basil with the tomato that went beyond mere protection. The settlers found that the two simply grew well together, thriving side by side in the same warm sun and rich soil, as though they were natural companions. To this day, gardeners plant basil at the foot of their tomatoes, half for the old belief in protection and half because the two seem to belong together in the garden and on the plate alike. Number 3. Mint. We have seen mint guard the home against rodents, but the settlers also enlisted its powerful scent in the garden against the insects and pests that troubled their crops and their comfort. That sharp, cool menthol smell is as unwelcome to many bugs as it is to mice. Settler gardeners planted mint near the vegetable beds and around the edges of the garden, where its strong scent helped repel ants, aphids, flies, and other small pests. It was also planted near the home and the sitting areas to help drive away the flies and mosquitoes that made warm evenings miserable. A patch of mint by the door was both a guardian and a comfort. The same menthol oils that make mint so refreshing to us overwhelm and confuse the senses of many insects, masking the scent of the crops nearby and making the area unpleasant for the pests. The settlers used this freely, though they knew mint's one great flaw, that it spreads aggressively, and so they often planted it where it could roam or kept it contained near what it guarded. And like the others, mint gave more than protection. It flavored food, made soothing teas in the old tradition, and freshened the home. A plant that guarded the garden, repelled the flies, and made a fine cup of tea earned its place many times over. To use it as the settlers did, plant mint around the garden edges and near sitting areas, giving it room of its own. The next plant was the golden guardian of the whole garden, and the settlers found the mint especially valuable because, unlike many garden plants, it thrived in the damp, shady, troublesome corners where other plants struggled, the very places where pests often gathered and bred. By planting mint in those difficult spots, the settlers turned a weak point of the garden into a fragrant line of defense, making use of ground that might otherwise have gone to waste and to the bugs. And the settlers valued mint as a guardian of their comfort as much as their crops. For the warm evenings of summer, when the family finally rested from the day's labor, were so often spoiled by the whine of mosquitoes and the buzz of flies. A few crushed sprigs of mint, or a patch of it growing close by the door and the sitting bench, helped keep those pests at bay and made the precious hours of evening rest a little sweeter. Protection and comfort from the same fragrant plant. Number 4. Garlic and onion. Our faithful pungent pair returns once more, for the settlers relied on garlic and onion against the insects of the garden just as they did against the larger pests. That sharp, sulfurous bite is a powerful weapon against the bugs that come hunting for tender crops. Settler gardeners planted garlic and onions throughout the vegetable beds and along the borders, tucking them in among the other crops. The strong smell rising from these plants was believed to repel and confuse a wide range of insect pests, from aphids to beetles, and to help protect the more vulnerable vegetables growing nearby. A clove of garlic among the roses or the carrots was a tiny standing guard. The settlers also made simple preparations, steeping crushed garlic and onion in water to make a pungent liquid that could be sprinkled over the plants, an early homemade version of the garlic sprays that organic gardeners still use today. It was a way to spread that protective scent across the whole garden, drawn entirely from plants they were growing anyway for food. And these simple homemade garlic and onion sprays were the beginning of a whole tradition of frontier garden remedies, born of necessity and cleverness. With no store to supply them, the settlers became inventive chemists of the kitchen and the garden, steeping, mixing, and brewing the plants around them into liquids to guard their crops. Much of what passes today for cutting-edge organic gardening is simply this old settler ingenuity, remembered and dusted off after a long forgetting. So garlic and onion were food, flavor, home protection, and crop protection, all from the same humble bulbs. Few plants worked harder across the whole homestead. To use them as the settlers did, plant garlic and onions throughout and around your vegetable beds. The next plant was the clever sacrifice that saved the rest. And the genius of using garlic and onion this way was that it cost the settler nothing extra at all. These were plants the family was already growing in abundance for the table. To tuck a few extra cloves and bulbs among the other crops, as living guardians, was simply to get a second job out of a plant they were planting anyway. That was the settler way through and through. Every plant, two purposes or more. And now we reach number 5, the one I promised you. A plant the settlers grew not to repel the pests, but to deliberately attract them, sacrificing itself to save the precious crops nearby. Number 5. Nasturtium. The nasturtium is a lovely trailing plant with round leaves and bright orange and red flowers, and it played one of the cleverest roles in the whole settler garden. It was what gardeners call a trap crop, a plant grown on purpose to lure the pests away from the vegetables and onto itself. Settler gardeners planted nasturtiums among and around their vegetables, and they noticed that aphids, those tiny sap-sucking pests, and certain beetles and caterpillars flocked to the nasturtium in great numbers. And here was the genius of it. While the pests swarmed the sacrificial nasturtium, they left the precious cabbages, beans, and squash alone. The gardener could then deal with the concentrated pests on that one plant, having saved the rest of the garden. It was a brilliant piece of natural strategy. Rather than trying to repel every pest from every plant, the settlers gave the enemy an irresistible target, drawing them into one place and away from the food. And the nasturtium asked for nothing in return, growing easily and blooming brightly, even as it took the hits meant for the crops. And there is a strange nobility in the role of the trap crop that the settlers seem to appreciate. The nasturtium gave itself up, drawing the swarming pests onto its own leaves and flowers so that the food crops nearby might live. In the tight economy of the survival garden, even sacrifice had its place and its purpose. The settlers wasted nothing, not even the role of bait, and the cheerful nasturtium played its part to the very end of the season. And, remarkably, the nasturtium was useful beyond its sacrifice, for its leaves and flowers are edible, with a pleasant, peppery bite, adding food and color to the settler table. A plant that protected the garden by sacrifice and still fed the family was a true marvel of frontier cleverness. To use it as they did, plant nasturtiums among and around the crops you most want to protect. The next plant was a feathery guardian with a powerful scent, and the settlers understood the deep cleverness of the trap crop in a way that even modern gardeners sometimes forget. Rather than waging an exhausting, losing war against every single pest in the garden, they simply gave the enemy what it wanted most, in one easy-to-watch place, and let the rest of the garden grow in peace. It was a strategy of cunning rather than force, of working with the appetites of the insects rather than against them. Number 6, dill. Dill is a tall, feathery, fragrant herb that the settlers valued both in the kitchen and as a clever guardian of the garden, for it worked in a way different from the others. Rather than only repelling the bad insects, dill helped by inviting the good ones. Settler gardeners planted dill among and near their vegetables, and its small clusters of tiny yellow flowers drew in the helpful insects, the natural predators that hunt and eat the garden pests. By welcoming these allies, the dill helped keep the populations of harmful bugs in check, letting nature itself do the work of protection. The settlers understood that not every insect was an enemy and that some were powerful friends. And of all the lessons in the settler garden, this one feels the most quietly profound. The settlers came to understand that they were not alone in their war against the pests, that the garden was alive with tiny allies, the predatory insects who hunted the very bugs that threatened the crops. By planting to welcome these friends, the settlers turned the whole living web of the garden to their purpose. They did not conquer nature. They befriended it and let it fight on their side. At the same time, dill's own strong scent was believed to help confuse and deter certain pests, adding a layer of direct protection. And dill was a generous food and seasoning, its leaves and seeds flavoring the family's food, and, famously, their pickles, helping preserve the harvest for winter. It even drew the caterpillars of certain butterflies, which some gardeners welcomed for their beauty. So dill was a magnet for helpful insects, a mild repellent of harmful ones, a kitchen herb, and a pickling spice that helped store food for winter. It shows another side of settler wisdom, that the cleverest gardener does not fight nature, but enlists it. To use it as they did, plant dill among your vegetables to draw in the helpful insects. The final plant was the bitter sentinel of the garden's edge, and this idea of inviting helpful insects rather than only repelling harmful ones was perhaps the most sophisticated of all the settlers' garden defenses. They understood, without any science to tell them, that the garden was a whole living community, full of friends as well as foes. By planting dill and a few other flowering herbs, they rolled out a welcome mat for the ladybugs, the lacewings, and the tiny wasps that hunt the garden pests, enlisting a whole army of allies for free. Number 7. Tansy. We end with tansy, a tall herb with button-like yellow flowers and a strong, sharp, camphor-like scent, which the settlers planted as one of the great guardian plants of the homestead garden. Its powerful smell made it a formidable foe of a wide range of insects and pests. Settler families planted tansy near the home, the kitchen garden, and even the doorways, where its strong scent was believed to repel flies, ants, beetles, and many other troublesome insects. Bunches of dried tansy were also brought indoors and laid among stored goods and meat to help keep the flies and pests away, an important job in the days before refrigeration. It was a guardian both in the garden and in the house. The strong aromatic oils that give tansy its sharp scent are the source of its power, overwhelming to the insects that came near. The settlers prized it as one of the most reliable insect-repelling plants they had, planting it as a fragrant living barrier at the edges of the garden and the home. I must add a word of caution, for tansy is a potent plant that was handled with care and is not for eating, a reminder that these old plants demand respect and knowledge. And tansy, with its sharp, insistent scent and its old reputation, reminds us that not every guardian plant was gentle. Some of these protectors were potent, even a little dangerous, and the settlers handled them with the same respect they gave to any powerful tool. They knew which plants could be eaten, and which were for guarding only, which were mild and which were strong. That careful knowledge of each plant's true nature and proper use was the heart of their craft. So tansy was a frontline guardian against the flying and crawling pests, in the garden and indoors alike, asking nothing but a place to grow. It is a fitting plant to end on, the bitter sentinel standing watch at the garden's edge. To use it as the settlers did, plant tansy at the borders of the garden and near the home, always with respect for its potency. And the settlers valued tansy as a guardian that worked indoors as faithfully as it did out in the garden. In the warm months, before there was any way to keep meat and food cold, flies were not merely a nuisance but a real threat to the family's hard-won provisions. A few bunches of strong scented tansy, laid in the larder and among the stored goods, helped hold those flies at bay, guarding the food itself. A guardian of the garden and the pantry both. So there you have it. 7 plants the early settlers grew to protect their crops from bugs without a single chemical. Marigold, the bright guardian above and below the soil. Basil, the fragrant protector of the tomatoes. Mint, the cool, scented repeller of flies and ants. Garlic and onion, the pungent pair that guarded the beds. Nasturtium, the brave sacrifice that lured the pests away. Dill, the clever host that invited the helpful insects. And tansy, the bitter sentinel of the garden's edge. Every one of them stood guard over the crops that kept a family alive, using nothing but scent, cleverness, and the natural order of things. The settlers did not poison their gardens. They worked with the living world around them, planting allies among their crops and letting the green guardians do their patient work. It is a wisdom worth remembering in our own gardens today. And in an age when we are all beginning to wonder about the chemicals we spray on the food we eat, there is something quietly hopeful in this old knowledge. The settlers grew clean, healthy food, free of any poison, not because they were idealists, but because they had no other choice, and they did it successfully enough to feed a growing nation. Their methods worked. They are not a quaint relic. They are a living, practical alternative, waiting patiently in the past for us to remember and use again. And these 7 are only part of the settlers' natural defenses. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full art of protecting a garden the old way, plant by plant, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Settler's Guide to a Chemical-Free Garden. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one, because the settlers did not only protect their crops. When those crops failed, or the winter ran long, they turned to the wild plants around them to survive. Next, I want to show you the forgotten weeds the pioneers relied on to survive the hardest times, the plants that stood between a family and hunger. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.